terima kasih sudah mau hadir di acara kami, Seminar IndoProgress, yang merupakan acara untuk bisa dibilang launching kami terhadap edisi perdana Jurnal IndoProgress. Walaupun kita tahu IndoProgress sudah sempat pernah mempublikasi jurnal IndoProgress sebelumnya, tapi pada kesempatan kali ini kami mencoba untuk memperbarui jurnal kami menjadi lebih serius, dikelola dengan lebih serius, di bawah tim yang lebih serius tentunya. Dan semoga pada kesempatan kali ini, karena jurnal pertama sudah meluncur keluar, kita membuka ruang diskusi gitu sebagai bagian untuk perayaan peluncuran perdana jurnal ini. Terima kasih sekali lagi buat kawan-kawan yang mau menyediakan waktunya di pagi hari ini. Pada kesempatan kali ini kita punya 3 pembicara yang akan yang pertama adalah kawan Teresa Tadem yang merupakan profesor di University of the Philippines di Center of kalau nggak salah CIDS ya, is right, Teresa? CIDS, Center for Integrative and Development Studies, right? In the University of the Philippines. Dan ada juga Inaya Rakhmani yang kebetulan adalah juga tim pro kita ya, kepala editor in chief Jurnal IndoProgress kali ini, yang dia adalah dosen FISIP UI jurusan Ilmu Komunikasi yang sudah mulai gelar doktor dan semoga menjadi profesor segera di UI ya. Yang ketiga ada Tika, kawan Tika di sini yang baru saja mengirimkan draft terakhir disertasinya dan semoga menjadi doktor setelah komen serta revisinya dari pembimbing. Jadi 3 pembicara ini kita sengaja berasal dari kalangan perempuan karena kita tahu banyak kritik terhadap gerakan kiri Indonesia yang seringkali didominasi oleh kalangan laki-laki. Jadi sebagai respon terhadap kritik itu tentu saja kita membuka ruang seluas-luasnya bagi kalangan perempuan di Indonesia untuk terlibat dalam gerakan kiri Indonesia gitu. Oke, dan buat teman-teman sekalian, diskusi dan presentasi akan dilakukan dalam bahasa Inggris, tapi jangan khawatir, di Zoom ini kami sediakan juga jasa interpretasi. Kalau teman-teman attendees melihat di sebelah bagian bawah kanan layar Zoom, itu ada interpretasi Indonesia English gitu. Jadi kalau misalkan ada presentasi dalam bahasa Inggris, mohon teman-teman sekalian mengklik presentasi dalam bahasa Indonesia, karena nanti ada translator yang akan mentranslasikan langsung presentasi dalam bahasa Inggrisnya itu menjadi bahasa Indonesia. Jadi yang akan teman-teman dengar nanti adalah dalam bahasa Indonesia gitu. Ini menjadi bagian juga supaya mengatasi gap bahasa Indonesia Inggris yang selama ini ada di masyarakat kita. Jadi sekian pembukaan dari saya. Saya harap diskusinya bisa berjalan dengan baik. Jadi floor yang tersedia saya serahkan ke Miss Teresa, Profesor Teresa. Profesor Teresa, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mohammed. Okay, good morning to everyone. I would like to congratulate Inaya Rakhmani, Editor-in-Chief, and the editorial team of Journal IndoProgress JIP on its maiden issue. This journal, which seeks to advance Marxist understanding and critique contemporary capitalism, is certainly most welcomed and long overdue as countries continue to experience political, economic, and social cultural crisis due to the continuing excesses of capitalism. These have certainly been exacerbated in this time of pandemic, as evidenced by the articles in this first volume of the JIP. A Marxist perspective allows one to completely comprehend and analyze such a situation and, more importantly, bring forth possible solutions and action in countering the forces which perpetuates the status quo. As I have relayed to Inaya, it was really such an honor for my article to be published in this journal, and I hope it will contribute in whatever way to this worthwhile endeavor. The journal also brings forth a deja vu when I was a research assistant in 1982 at the University of the Philippines Third World Studies Center. I think all of you are not yet born, even your parents. Okay, my first academic home in the university. Founded in 1977 by then UP College of Arts and Sciences Dean Francisco Nemenso, popularly known as Dodong Nemenso, a Marxist and former member of the Politburo of the Marxist-Leninist Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas, or Old Communist Party of the Philippines. Its founding director, Randy David, a non-aligned left intellectual, established the journal Kasarinlan, Philippine Journal of Third World Studies, in 1985, which, like the Journal IndoProgress, sought to publish critical articles, mainly on political economy and social movements. Kasarinlan, which means autonomy, unwittingly became a venue of the debates which were ensuing in the new Communist Party of the Philippines, which was established in 1969. Its military arm, the New People's Army, the NPA, and its united front, the National Democratic Front, or the CPP-NPA-NDF, which found a voice in the journal. As I mentioned in my GIP article, these debates concerned the following: whether the class and armed struggle should have priority over NGO development work, as well as over non-class struggles such as the rights of women and indigenous peoples, and whether guerrilla warfare or a protracted people's war of surrounding the city from the countryside should trump over urban warfare, among others, which was happening in El Salvador in the late 1970s that time. With regard to the latter, urban warfare succeeded in overthrowing the Marcos dictatorship in the 1986 People Power Revolution, which happened in Epifanio de los Santos Avenue, or EDSA, a major highway in Metro Manila. Thus, this uprising is also known as the 1986 EDSA Revolution. After the 1986 People Power Revolution, these debates intensified and ultimately led to the split of the CPP-NPA-NDF in 1992 between two factions, that is, the reaffirmist RA and the rejectionist RJs. The RAs, or reaffirm, are those who maintain that the CPP should continue to strictly adhere to the orthodox Marxist, Leninist, and Maoist principles that they had advanced from the early days of the CPP, while the RJs are those who reject this. The middle-class elements in the CPP, NPA, NDF, as well as other left formations, would play a crucial role in the pursuit of the legal struggle. One was the formation of NGOs, cooperatives, and civil society organizations, or CSOs, carrying development work as well as advocacies, both class-based, workers' rights, and non-class-based, that is, environmental and human rights causes. This faction of the left movement viewed the movement away from focusing mainly on an organized political force to win state power, as emphasized by Leninism in its war of position, which spans successive conjunctures, shifting the balance of forces through intervention at various sites, and particularly within civil society. In the Philippine popular movement, this Gramscian position allows for what popular democracy, or POP-DEM leader, and former NDF head Horacio Boy Morales defines as people empowerment. That is, the transfer of economic and social power from one center to another, and or to create new centers of socioeconomic powers complementary to or in competition with the traditional centers. The two strategies, that is the armed struggle.
Sorry, Teresa. Excuse me.
Yes.
Can you make us speak a little bit slower because
I'm sorry.
yeah,
Okay.
sorry. For the translator,
Should I repeat anything?
Sure.
Or I'll go ahead.
Just go ahead. Thank you.
Sorry. These two strategies, that is the armed struggle and the use of legal means would continue to play out after the 1986 People Power Revolution until the present. The left in general were aware that the country merely shifted from authoritarianism to elite democracy. Although the left continued to create democratic spaces through NGOs, CSOs, among others, the reality was the need to capture power through elections, and in the case of the mainstream left, even if one is waging an armed struggle. And this is where I would like to focus the rest of my talk, given the coming 2022 national elections, which will decide the next Philippine president. With the advent of the 1986 People Power Revolution, the mainstream left, that is the CPP and PNDF, was quick to take advantage of the first trappings of procedural democracy, which was the return of electoral politics. It joined this with the formation of the Partido ng Bayan, Party of the Nation, or PNB. It ran prominent left personalities for the Senate, with no less than the founder of the New People's Army, Bernabe, Commander Dante Buscaino, and the National Democratic Front's Morales. It also presented itself as different from the traditional political parties by framing its issues within nationalist and democratic politics. But the left electoral party failed miserably. None of its candidates made it to the Senate, consisting of 24 people, and only 2 out of the 71 House of Representative candidates did. The reality was that electoral politics remained to be the arena of traditional politicians with their respective wealth, electoral party machinery, and even private armies. Because of this, the left campaigned for an electoral politics mechanism which would allow them to enter the Philippine Congress without competing with traditional politicians. This was the party list electoral system, which was embodied in the 1987 Constitution. The Philippines is a presidential system. So it's like majority vote, and then you win. Even if you win by 20%, as long as you have more over. Unlike, again, in Indonesia, which is a parliamentary system, which runs parties, and the parties have their nominees. It is different under a presidential system. So this party list electoral system allotted a maximum of 3 seats in the House of Representatives to marginalized sectors who are able to gain at least 6% of votes cast for the party list parties. So initially, the party list parties identified with civil society organizations, CSOs from the left, were able to gain the support of traditional politicians. An example of this was Bayan Muna, Country First, which is identified with the CPP and PANDF, and Akbayan, which is identified with the RJ faction of the CPP, as well as Democratic Socialists, and other independent left formations. Through the years, however, left-wing party-list parties have faced stiff competition from parties established by religious charismatic movements. These include El Shaddai, an evangelical movement whose Buhay Party or Life Party topped the party list elections in 2007. El Shaddai was also the spiritual advisor of former President Joseph Estrada. While Iglesia ni Cristo, Church of Christ, whose party was the Alagad Party, made it to the top 10. Iglesia ni Cristo, composed of around 3 million members, would always give their full support to the dictatorship during the martial law period. And then you have the newly formed Citizens Battle Action Corruption Party, CIBAC, of the Jesus is Lord movement, whose leader, Eddie Villanueva, was actually once a member of the CPP during the time of Jose Maria's season in the 1970s in the university. They were contemporaries. This gradually started the marginalization of the left party list parties, which was aggravated further by the incursions of traditional politicians who established their own parties under this electoral system. An example of this was the Ang Galing Filipino, the Filipino is Great party list party for security guards, who is represented in Congress by Juan Miguel Mikey Arroyo, the eldest son of former Philippine President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. So they start to establish parties for the marginalized sectors, but the traditional politicians are the ones representing them. For the left, therefore, it believed that the only way to survive was to ally with traditional politicians, as was the case of the Alliance of Rural Concerns Party.
Teresa, 5 minutes left. 5 minutes left.
Okay, I'll just ARC, just stop me anytime, was the party list of the Left Formation Peace, Partnership for Ecumenical Action and Community Empowerment, consisting of mainly members of the RJ faction. So a strategy which ARC adopted was to get Narciso, the son of a traditional politician, Miriam Defensor Santiago, who was the Corazon Aquino administration's Secretary of Agrarian Reform, to be the #1 candidate of the ARC in order to win. So this brought about divisions in the party, with a faction of the peace organization leaving the ARC. Alliances with traditional politicians also meant compromising or even abandoning a left agenda. The 2010 national elections further highlighted the absence of a feasible and winnable left alternative, whereby CSOs identified with the left ideological blocs of Akbayan, Bayan Muna, and Sanlakas chose to support the presidential candidates of traditional politicians. This continued to play out in the 2016 national elections, but nothing came out of such an alliance, and the left, both the CPP and the non-CPP, continued to be marginalized in both the legislative and executive branches of government. Just tell me when to stop, Mohammed.
Okay.
Should I stop now?
You have 3 minutes left.
Okay. This coming 2022 presidential election, just a second. It's also, this coming 2022 elections is also a deja vu of this proven and failed strategy and tactic of the left movement. But maybe I'd just like to come out with the last paragraph. Now, the seemingly maverick in the left movement is Laban ng Masa, Fight of the Masses, who is fielding Leodigario Calyodi de Guzman for president under a socialist platform, that is, a democratic socialist electoral platform for 2022 elections. Kalyodi, Ka is kasama for comrade, is a former garments factory worker who was politicized and became an activist in the 1980s with the assassination of Chief Marcos Fo, former Senator Benigno Aquino. He is running under the party Partido Lakas ng Masa, Party of the Forces of the Masses. His vice presidential candidate is Walden Bello, an academic scholar activist and former member of the CPP. Bello is also a global civil society movement personality and a former member of the House of Representatives representing Akbayan, a left political party. So maybe I'd like to end here. It's a combination of someone from the working class, someone from the middle class and intellectual vying for the presidential and vice presidential positions in this coming 2022 elections. And it's actually the first time this has happened since the 1930s when there was a socialist party which ran. They won 2 seats, but they were taken out. They were outlawed by the current Philippine government with US assistance. So this is the first time. So we are still looking at how this will unravel. The elections are still in May 2022. Okay, thank you. I'll stop there. Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you, Teresa. Terima kasih, Teresa, atas presentasinya. Presentasi yang menarik, sebenarnya pada dasarnya memberikan penjelasan tentang kesulitan-kesulitan perjuangan gerakan kiri Filipina setelah demokratisasi, yang mana agenda kiri bisa dibilang sampai dengan tahun 2020 cenderung termarginalisasi, tidak ada ruang sama sekali karena dominasi kekuatan politik lama dan juga tentu oligarki di Filipina. Tapi sekarang ini sudah ada perkembangan di mana gerakan kiri mencoba untuk menjadi lebih terbuka, mencoba untuk mengusung platformnya sendiri dengan tadi calon dari PLM, Partido Lakas Masa, yang mana presidennya berasal dari gerakan buruh, tapi wakil presidennya berasal dari kalangan intelektual. Kombinasi yang sebenarnya bukan hal yang baru gitu. Kalau kita lihat di Bolivia, ada juga Evo Morales dengan Garcia Linera. Evo Morales berasal dari serikat buruh, Garcia Linera ini intelektual. Itu sedikit simpulan yang bisa saya tawarkan ini. Buat para penonton, ada kolom Q&A di sini. Jadi kalau ada pertanyaan langsung aja dilempar di Q&A. Saya sebagai moderator akan langsung melihatnya, dan juga akan ketika forum Q&A ini akan dibuka, saya akan merujuk langsung ke pertanyaan yang diajukan oleh attendees di sini di kolom Q&A. Jadi bisa lihat di bawah, di samping partisipan itu ada Q&A. Jadi silakan fungsikan kolom ini. Jadi setelah semuanya sudah memberikan presentasi, saya sebagai moderator akan membuka ruang tanya jawab gitu. Dan untuk membuatnya lebih terstruktur dan sistematis, mohon gunakan kolom Q&A. Jadi karena kita melihat membludaknya penonton di sini, kita kalau memungkinkan kita akan membuka tanya jawab melalui suara, tapi kalau nggak memungkinkan kita akan tetap fokus di kolom Q&A. Mungkin itu dulu. Sesi selanjutnya silakan Inaya, dan mohon maaf sebelumnya saya nggak kasih tahu ke Teresa bahwa saya ada mohon maaf, ada slot waktu 20 menit untuk presentasi. Kepada kawan Inaya, dipersilahkan.
Terima kasih, Ridho. I'll be speaking in English because I'd very much like to interact as well with Teresa, because for me personally and politically, this is a social process that we need to maintain so that our respective experiences with being part of a left movement can also interact with each other. I obviously read your article, I edited your article. We also work in another setting and under institutional university structures. And it your mentioning of a democratic space latched onto me, because this democratic space comprising of intellectual and activists is a dynamic space in which every individual, every organization, every alliance is changing as social conditions also change. And having a left agenda is as important as maintaining that democratic space in which the proponents of the democratic agenda and the left agenda are utilizing the instruments made available, contradictory by neoliberal capitalism, especially so during the pandemic. This is an example of that practice. We're talking over Zoom. Teresa, you are thousands of kilometers away. We got to know each other virtually through your writing, through our emails, through our workshop discussions. And that is part and parcel to the widening of the democratic space that allows for a stronger left movement. Every communication, every social process is a part of a process of consolidation between intellectuals and activists, whether between regions, between cities, between rural urban areas in Indonesia, as well as between Indonesia and the Philippines and the larger area of Southeast Asia. Because in solidarity, we all experience repression and the constraining of our intellectual movements and activism in different ways, but no less fundamentally the same. For all of the participants, before the webinar was opened, we had a small chat with Teresa and Tika as well. And I know that all of you here do not need to be reminded of what happened in 1965 in Indonesia, in which the left was annihilated by the authoritarian, by General Suharto and then ensuing authoritarian regime. Our universities throughout those decades were geared towards state and economic developmentalism, prepping our markets for imported, the increasing movements of peoples and goods through the signing of the free market agreement, the GATT. Since then, many of the activists, left intellectuals, have been able to take advantage of the widening space of labor markets, especially in the intellectual and student market and university market in Southeast Asia. Some of the most prominent were the late Arif Budiman, Ariel Haryanto, and Fedi Hadis, which in their own way maintain their intellectual leanings and sympathy towards whatever is left of the left movement in Indonesia. As many scholars have mentioned, especially so Fedi, who is here, who is also your friend, reformasi and democratization resulted in the reorganization of the centralized power, and the oligarchy is very much still alive and kicking. What does this mean for us as intellectuals sympathizing with Marxist thinking and those wanting an end to capitalism, not only where we are, but all over the world? We had a discussion as well when we launched the Institute, IndoProgress Institute for Social Research and Education. Under the absence of having mentorship, under the absence of having left intellectuals passing on traditions to the next generation, this generation of scholars, intellectuals, and activists come intellectuals, or the other way around, began our indoctrination, idealization through books, through textbooks. We come from the middle class, the very bourgeoisie you're talking about, Teresa. We are skillful in formal legal instruments and university instruments. We understand the language of neoliberalism that we also criticize through our writing. However, at the same time, we're also inevitably complicit in reproducing the kinds of inequalities that we criticize. By virtue of being able to speak English, by virtue of being able to read and write, by virtue of having the ability to have this stable, somewhat stable internet connection and gadgets to access, we are practically, actually, definitively not laborers. At the same time, though, Tika will talk about this in deep in her own presentation, some of the elements of suffering and precarity that vital workers face during the pandemic, having to work even though there is a health crisis, having to be mobile even though there's no clear social protection and health protection. That kind of suffering, I think we can relate to, sympathize with, and empathize regardless of our social status and class status, as long as we maintain that left agenda of redistributing access and power as much as we can, as much as material conditions permit within the current capitalist structure, and for that, a proper analysis of the modes of production, the modes of consumption, and also the variations of exploitation as experienced specifically by women, by lower classes, by the poor, by ethnic minorities, by people in rural areas, by people with disabilities, all need to be part of the very democratic space you vouch for, Teresa. We very much agree with the democratic space that you argue for. And in that, it's less important to argue about whether someone is Puritan or not, someone is Orthodox or not. The very important point is to make sure that whatever social position we have, instruments of privilege that we have, become tools to redistribute access and power to as many people as possible under the material conditions that we are part of. That requires trust, bonding, consolidation of power, such Zoom meetings, such messenger groups, such offline meetings that happen much more sporadically compared to in the 80s that our seniors and mentors experienced, because under the neoliberal structure, we are increasingly fragmented, individualized, atomized, and also under casual contracts. We are socially displaced, economically displaced, in spite of being traditionally, or by definition of Orthodox Marxism, part of the bourgeoisie. Precarity and labor movement are very much fundamentally of a common experience of exploitation. Our class position must be understood under contemporary capitalist changes, and that was the spirit in which we collectively wrote the introduction of our journal. That was the reason why we chose the pandemic, because rather than seeing it as a multidimensional crisis defined by technocratic approaches as a condition in which we need to respond with technically, we saw it as a historical moment, a historical rupture in which social inequalities, suffering came to the surface. And the task of left-leaning intellectuals is to understand the variations of exploitation that was made much clearer during the pandemic. I was especially touched by or affected by the article written by our comrades in India discussing about Dalit workers. 100% of sanitation workers in India are Dalits. They are the invisible, they are mute, and they are part of the sanitation structure inherited from the British colonialist regime. When we speak about the bourgeoisie, when we speak about the elite, there is a racial element, an ethnic element, a religious element to it. Rather than problematizing identity politics, bringing those variations into the agenda, the left agenda, the redistributive agenda, is as important as acknowledging the variations of experiences in regards to exploitation under contemporary neoliberal capitalism. Ridha, how much time left do I have?
You still have 7 minutes.
Okay. I'd like to speak about, I would like to latch on to an argument made by Fedi in the launching of IISRE, the IndoProgress Institute for Social Research and Education. What it is we need to do as millennials, zillennial generations of left intellectuals. My generation, I was born in the early 80s, Teresa, just as you began being part of the left in the Philippines. Many of our alumni in our informal school, we have weekend schools regarding progressive Islam and Marxism, schools about oligarchy, about labor movement, and also about carrying out critical social science research across proponents in the NGO sector. So making Marxist terminologies familiar to a variation of people coming from different employment and sectors. It was a very de-alienating process for me personally, because many of the alumni are high school graduates, some are PhD graduates, some are prolific writers, but in that space, in that social space, which was carried out by Zoom. Special thanks here for Safitri Mohan and Gun Ponto, who organized the classes. The immaterial actions, the immaterial aspects or ideas materialize into actions, and then it's scaled up into options of co-funding. There are now options to have the school based on subscription, based on donations, and we also instilled subsidies and scholarships for those coming from eastern part of Indonesia. We also took into account the uneven digital access throughout the region. We also took into account the ability or literacy in reading English materials in which most of Marxist readings are written in. We use short videos available and open access through YouTube, crash courses on ideologization, crash courses on coding, which made available and more accessible accessing reading materials visually and audio based for laborers who can access such with limited internet connection during the weekends. Actions in democratic spaces that is permitted through the neoliberal instruments of digital platforms become one of the technocratic or legal skills or literacy skills that the bourgeoisie has, that Teresa mentioned, that also needs to be utilized, mobilized to redistribute access. It comes not only in the form of ideals wanting to revolutionize, but it comes in the very everyday politics that we need to face in our daily setting. Eduardo Tadem, Tessa's partner and ally and UP CIDS sent me an article over an email written by an author from the Philippines called Everyday Socialism, in which during the pandemic, food pantries were open across the region so that people who have lost work, people who are poor, have access to food. Everyday socialism, everyday Marxism can come in the tiniest form, it can come in the largest form of ideals, but latching on to the democratic space, it needs to be acted out, not only through words, but also through actions, so that the immaterial can be mobilized, externalized, and institutionalized, but in a critical way, into alliances and a maintaining of momentum. This is
2 minutes left, sorry.
Yes,
Yeah.
this is the end of the talk that I would like to open. We too, Tessa, experience fragmentation within our movement, within which there are issues about people of the left who went into bureaucracy and are seen as part of the power structure. But your presentation reminded us that having allies higher up is also important so we can mobilize the left agenda. And it's also important to keep them in the left movement because it's very much a social process and ideologization process of ideologization, because as power is internalized and interacts with our allies in higher up positions, they are also vulnerable to be part of the oligarchy. So maintaining that relationship, pulling them into our discussions, pulling them into our immaterial and material conditions of that democratic space is a responsibility that the bourgeoisie need to hold so that access and power are redistributed. I'll end it with that. Tika, I think, will speak more about the precarious in universities in Indonesia. I'd like to, I'm not supposed to do this, but I'm here as the editor-in-chief of IndoProgress, but I'm also the director of the Asia Research Center. It's actually a historical accident and a funny joke because Dick Robinson, Fedi's teacher, Fedi is my teacher. So there's a historical materialism that emerged with different times. Is also the inaugural director of the Asia Research Center in Murdoch University, in which I was an alumni. And that's also a democratic space that I very much want to connect with IndoProgress, but we need to look at whether material conditions permit. But clearly the agenda is one of the same. Tika here is a senior research fellow at ARC, and she'll be talking about her experience or reflexivity in terms of connecting precarious labor under digital capitalism with the experiences of lecturers as labor. Thank you so much for the time, Tessa. It's really lovely to hear your presentation.
Thank you.
Terima kasih Inaya atas presentasinya. Ya, udah dikasih sedikit pengantar sama Inaya juga. Tanpa banyak basa-basi, silakan kawan Tika.
Makasih Rido. Thank you Naya and Teresa for the presentation. I choose to speak in English today, not because I have a perfect English, but I would like to use the space that we have today to connect not only with Teresa, but also with the broader left movement in the Philippines and elsewhere, because almost finishing my PhD, I feel that I need to put whatever I've learned in school in practice. So I'm using this space to learn to do that. Teresa and Inaya have pointed to wider democratic space that has made it possible for left intellectual and activists to align their forces, even that it is plagued by fragmentation. I would like to further reflect on the social conditions of left intellectuals, especially the extent to which we could freely use our Marxian approach in our research and teaching, and also advance left agenda in our work. Inaya has mentioned that we are clearly not labor, because it's clear that we are in a better position now. We have a good internet connection. We have time to talk in this event. We don't need to be on the street working. However, I have somehow found some similarities between working as an academic in an Indonesian university and working as a driver of on-demand transport service, known in Indonesia as online taxi and ojek. As a background, for the past couple of years, I've studied the expansion of precarious work, insecure and uncertain employment where workers has limited statutory entitlements provided by labor laws and their effect on workers. My PhD project especially deals with the subjective experiences of workers in the online transport services and their politics. During the interview and in the process of writing my thesis, to my surprise, well, not really surprising, I repeatedly found similarities in my work as an academic and the work of those people that I interviewed, the driver in the online transport service, work as a lecturer and a researcher in an Indonesian university, not so much different from those driver, has been shaped by the restructuration of work on a global scale, where more firms utilize precarious work, flexibilization, casualization, and such practices have become the norm in workplaces, including in university. I argue in the thesis, which I can also see happening in the universities, is that this whole dynamic in the world of work has result in the individualization of work process, also the individualization of work problems in universities, which also cause accelerating atomization of academic workers. And these two have had effects on lefty scholarship. When I talk about individualization of work process and work problem in university, I refer to the process in which work has increasingly become an individualized experience, a condition in which we as academic workers see ourselves as the bearer of work most related risk. This then result in our justification of our own self-exploitation. We work long hours, we accept the burden of teaching jobs, admin, research project, and there's also, we realize that we still need to do some academic work. We need to write, we need to publish, and those kind of work. But if one needs to make a sacrifice, it is the academic work that we will sacrifice, because the pressure to produce academic work is low compared to the pressure to teach, to do admin job, and to be engaged in research consultancy. In this kind of situation, we are habituated to personalize our work-related problems, also the solutions. We think that we can only rely on ourselves to survive the environment. it's easier to see your colleague as an enemy, the one that make it harder for you to finish your work because they're lazy, rather than to see the structural underpinning of the problem at work. So how do this affect the life scholarship? Based on my experience, under the circumstances, there is no place for life scholarship in the academic world, and there's also less sympathy for life agenda, even among us who are actually exploited in the workplace. It's also becoming more challenging to engage with social knowledge production that is critical of the ruling regime and the capital. Back to my interview during my research with the drivers in the online transport service, I found that they normalize the poor working condition using the entrepreneurial narrative. These workers perceive themselves as an entrepreneur rather than employees of the companies. They believe in the illusion that they have freedom over work condition, although in reality, the company exercises strict control over the way work is done. In my experience as an academic, I found a great majority of lecturers and scholars normalize the exploitative condition, believing that they are part of the intellectual circle. Many of them busy to do research as objective as they could, employing positivist method. Few of them has published good quality articles, let alone using critical approach. I was wondering, how did this happen to us? How is it possible that me, part of the middle class, has experienced being in the workplace which share similarities with those that I interview? I think I will guess that this whole process is related to the marketization of university, where universities have increasingly been pushed to meet the demand of the market. This means more classes to teach, to gain revenue for the unis, increase demand to produce marketable product. So the task of the lecturer now is to produce courses that is marketable, that can gain revenue for the universities, more online classes, more internship, more research consultancy project to get funding from the government, international donor agencies, the private sectors, probably political parties. Another thing is the precarious career trajectory in universities. In Indonesian universities, probably half of academic staff are employed as civil servants. Inaya has mentioned that he too is a civil servant. Recruitment follow mostly closed or semi-closed system. While recruitment has becoming more open, the insularity remains. The faculty members will prefer to employ researchers and lecturers who have been employed casually. So a couple of colleagues, including myself, we've been employed casually in the university before we actually gain a more permanent, we secure a more permanent position. Within the precarity, we need to survive. So this push us to work and work and work. Within the circumstances, when the left scholarship was heavily repressed under the new order, the left agenda and discourse remain to be absent in the academic discourse, even when we are in a very exploitative working condition. We cannot relate to workers, for instance. There's also a lack of social basis. We cannot, there's no space for us to articulate our grief at work, at the working
place. 5 minutes left.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I'm almost done. So that's how it is at the university. But actually, the social circumstances that create obstacles for us also provide some opportunities, although it's very limited. In my own experience, opportunities to build solidarity, for instance, come from the opportunities to study abroad through scholarship. Having scholarship and studying abroad actually provide me a way to see the workplace from a different perspective. Because I went to Melbourne for my PhD, I saw how the union works and how it's actually not fair to be in that kind of situation. Another thing is that there's also an avenue for us to use research funding to actually advance the critical approach and the left agenda. That's what Inaya probably mentioned by instrumentalizing the neoliberal instrument. The challenge here, because in a world where Marxian terminology is not well accepted, we need to frame our research agenda and concern in a way that is acceptable by the government and international organizations to get research fundings. And it's not always easy, but that's what some of small institutions that we can establish at the university try to do. That's what Inaya and I have been trying to do, for example, through Asia Research Center. Okay, I think.
Thank you, Tika. Terima kasih, Tika, atas presentasinya. Saya nggak mau memberikan kesimpulan, silakan kawan-kawan sendiri yang menonton presentasinya memberikan kesimpulan. Jadi yang ingin saya ingatkan di sini adalah ruang tanya jawab sudah terbuka. Silakan gunakan ruang Q&A yang sudah disediakan di Zoom untuk bertanya apapun terkait dengan presentasi yang sudah disajikan oleh 3 presenter di sini. Jadi saya mulai dari satu pertanyaan dari kawan Rolip Saptamaji. Dia bertanya tentang bagaimana kita menemukan kesamaan antara gerakan kiri Indonesia dengan Filipina dalam ruang politik formal parlementer. Mungkin karena Teresa, ya ini pertanyaan yang kalaupun Teresa punya gambaran tertentu tentang Indonesia, silakan dipresentasikan. Jadi ini pertanyaan untuk Teresa, tapi saya juga akan buka kalau Inaya atau Tika punya komentar, silakan. Kemudian Teresa, silakan.
Oh, not in terms of the parliamentary form, but more of regional alliances. For example, even in the 1980s, we had this Asian Regional Exchange for New Alternatives, where Arif Budiman was among them, including people like, I don't know if you still know them, the Wamra Harjo, Ignas Clayton of LP3S. So in other words, there was a solidarity movement already during the period, the authoritarian period. And from there, so in other words, in terms of the solidarity there was among the people's movement. And maybe just and they basically with intellectuals, because when Arena was basically for more theoretical, forming with academics and people heading NGOs, which are based on the grassroots. But I'm not familiar with regards to the parliamentary at that level, at the formal level, because I guess our parties are also weak. It's really more the level of social movements. And of course, when I mentioned about technology, the anti-globalization movement was carried out, made possible because of the internet. Internet, the formation. I mean, even World Social Forum, and that was where people. And I did my own study in Thailand on the anti-Asian Development Bank campaigns for 9 months. So it was really, that was when the internet was really being mobilized. And actually, there was a debate whether how cold it was to do all this organizing to the internet. So it was there, the social media. But I mean, I think that's it, but not so much in the formal links of left parties or left movements in electoral politics.
Okay, thank you, Teresa, for your. Are there any comments from other presenter, Inaya, Tika, for this kind of question? Or we can move to next question.
I do. If
okay, sure, please.
My question is for Tessa and Tika. The question for Tessa is: you mentioned fragmentation across or between reaffirmists and rejectionists. I understand this as those wanting to hold on to orthodox Marxism and those wanting to adapt with changing characteristic of capitalism. How, on your experience, what were the actions, dynamics that maintained a common definition of a left movement in the Philippines? Yeah, and my question for Tika is, how do you think solidarity across lectures can be strengthened, especially also considering intellectuals and lecturers not only come from different institutions, but also different sectors, from the NGO sector, CSO, and Tessa mentioned some of them are rights-based, some of them are environmentalist. So that was my question for Tika. Thank you. Over to Ridho and then Teresa, I think. Thank you.
Oke, that's itu pertanyaan dari salah satu presenter terhadap presenter yang lain. Teresa, so yeah, you might also already hear the question. You want to make response on it? Please, Teresa.
I'm sorry. Okay. Or maybe going back to Inaya about the left. Generally, the Philippine government will just lump everybody as part of the left. They will not differentiate. But there is really a major distinction. The reaffirms basically believe in passing to a national democracy where you ally first with the national bourgeoisie. This was still so that defines the strategy. So you can link with traditional politicians and carry on their agenda. And after that, when you get rid of what the capitalists there. But the other is the socialists, those mainly in the RJ, which I believe that go straight to socialism. Whether you're bourgeoisie or national bourgeoisie, you're exploitative. It doesn't matter. So this was formed with the Movement for Socialist Thought and Action, BSIG, actually even in 1985. So that's a big, in other words, why do you have to go to this national democratic frame? Go straight to socialism. And this plays out in electoral politics, because for the CPP-NPA, the strategy is still to align with traditional politicians. And it's quite pathetic because they place their eggs all on the current Vice President Robredo to run for president. And when she declared her presidency, not a single left player was in her senatorial slate. They're composed of traditional politicians and billionaires, which says something of them. So they were left, like, what happens? Like wet blankets, So for socialism, there's no point in allying with the traditional politicians, because we have been pulled in. I think a number of your left personalities also in Indonesia have been pulled into government, right? And sometimes they also get transformed. In the Philippines, it's worse. They get pulled, but there's no party agenda at all. They get pulled because of personalities, and sometimes it breaks a big difference. And I think you can see that in Brazil, the Workers' Party, but the movement dies. But ours is even worse. You don't bring in the party agenda. So that's very clear. And even among the rejectionists, there's been splintering groups. So there was hope that during the 2016 elections, there was time to heal already and have a united front, all the left. But President Duterte pulled members from the associated with the CPP to his cabinet, first time. So there was a agrarian reform secretary who was from the peasantry, but they did not get the appointment they needed from Congress, which was elite dominated. And President Duterte didn't do much of it. So that really broke it again. So again, when you say they actually, the strategy differs. And that's very major. But I think the end goal is the same. It's socialism, but to get there is a major difference, which defines also the strategy. Okay, so I don't know if that answers your
my question. I remember in your article you mentioned there's no clear economic agenda and a proposal within the Ministry of Economy that can maintain the socialist agenda and the economic policies implemented. I remember that in your article. So that's very, very clear. Thank you, Teresa.
Silakan Tika merespon pertanyaannya Inaya.
Sorry, the question is how to build solidarity among academic workers, researchers, and lecturers. I think one of the things that we can do is to do more academic work, but that will be more research, not based on consultancy for the government or the companies, but research with an academic agenda. That will be the most challenging to do, though, because as I said, when academics need to sacrifice something, it will be the academic work that we will sacrifice, because the pressure to do academic job is actually not as big as the pressure to do the admin job and teaching. So yeah, I think that will be a way to build solidarity, because I remember even in University of Indonesia, there's attempts to build a union for the teaching staff, but in an environment where we are so highly individualized and labor movement was heavily repressed, it doesn't resonate with our experience. As for me, as someone being raised in the 90s, I didn't, to be honest, I didn't get what's the purpose of joining union, not until I went to Melbourne and I saw how the union works at the uni. So yeah, so I think we need to use instrument that every one of us familiar with, and it's academic work, research. But the research needs to be different. Okay, thank you.
The research needs to be left on the lab.
Okay. There's another question from our attendees here. Ada pertanyaan yang lain dari salah satu penonton kita, namanya anonymous attendee. Dia bertanya, dan mungkin terkait juga sama pertanyaan yang diajukan oleh Inaya di sini tentang bagaimana kita, apakah Tika bisa mengelaborasi lebih lanjut gitu, atau yang lain gitu, bagaimana kalangan kelas menengah seperti kita ini yang punya edukasi ini bisa punya hubungan yang lebih baik dengan kelas pekerja secara keseluruhan gitu, tanpa harus bersikap patronizing atau apa ya, merendahkan gitu. Itu pertanyaan yang pertama. Yang kedua, dia lebih kayak komentar aja tentang penggunaan kata reformasi, karena itu mengimplikasikan bahwa sistem bisa diubah dari dalam gitu, yang mana banyak akademisi berupaya untuk berargumen tentang itu. Yaitu pertanyaan dan juga komentar. Silakan kalau ada Tika, Inaya, or Teresa want to make comments on that question, please. And by the way, please make your statement slower because the translator kind of have problem following the argument. Thank you. Maybe Inaya, you want to make remarks on this?
How to better connect with working class people. Okay. Because I'm trained in media and sociology, communication sociology. So I began my journey as an academic by understanding actions and words. So it's micro, and then I continued on the journey with Asian studies for my PhD. So the structural analysis came later on rather than early on. Based on that experience and personal tactic, the best way is actually to sit next to people and experience their suffering and finding a common experience, a common feeling, or a common social position, in spite of coming from a very different personal history. So it's historical materialism applied individually. And with that kind of regularity, you would find yourself being marginalized by the marginal just because you look different. You wear clothes that they interpret as part of the bourgeoisie that they hate, because in their experience, the bourgeoisie are their majikan, are their informal bosses, Teresa. So domestic workers have bosses in their house, and there's a blurred space between labor and domestic, and that's normalized in the structure. And with that action, that agency, the consequence is that the sympathy developed is for the common suffering we experience with those who come from the working classes, but element of marginalizations that they experience, we experience too, because anyone part of the 99% knows what it feels like to be exploited. So patronizing or out of touch, if you still keep that in your mind that you are better than someone else, it wouldn't allow the resocialization or internalization of common suffering, a common left agenda in everyday politics. What's a bit trickier is the everyday socialist pantries in the Philippines, Ed has said, is now replicated by the Duterte government. So it's a multi-layered process of re-internalizing based on our active actions So building leftism not as a theory, but as an action, because materially, it's not only constrained in Indonesia, it's annihilated. So that is my response to your first question. And the second is the continuing word of reformasi as opposed to revolution. It implies that the system can be changed from inside, which is basically what academics are trying to do. As an academic, with our political agenda here, the political agenda in Jurnal IndoProgress, inside and outside are labels given from people looking at conditions spatially with their construct. What we understand is whether reformasi, whether democracy, it's a material condition with contradictions within larger capitalist changes. There are instruments that change in microseconds if we look at algorithms. There are changes in microseconds with human relationships that intersect between virtual and offline actions that relate to your first question. So I do not subscribe to the understanding of being inside or outside. I am partial to those who are suffering because I know what it feels like. Whether I'm an academic, whether I'm an activist, whether I'm a mother, whether I ally with domestic workers, sanitation workers by talking to them in the morning when they pick up trash. These are all actions to me. I don't see it as inside or outside. It's a moment of action in which I was part of socially because material condition permits. So that would be my response. Over to you again, Ridha.
Makasih Inaya atas tanggapannya. Silakan Tika for your response, please.
Okay, thank you. I might just add something. For me, when we talk about being patronizing, it's not only towards the working class, those that are different from us. For me, we can also be patronizing among ourselves, even among those that is part of the lefty movement. We can there's a debate and a fight between those who use Marxism in a more orthodox way or the more eclectic way, or those who see themselves as an activist or as academic, because the activists would say the academics, they do nothing, they produce knowledge, they don't get involved with people in the street. We could also we are vulnerable of doing it to ourselves. What I would like to say is realizing that we are, as Inaya said, part of the common suffering, and there's a limitation to what we can do, to what others can do. And I think the most tricky thing to do is to align our agenda, align our interests, and while being aware of the differences, but being in the marginalized position, it's important to be able to see people that we can align with in our tactic and strategy in everyday life. So yes, that would be my answer, Ridha. And the other thing about reformation, as an academic, I cannot see myself as a reformist. I don't think I can change the system, not in this generation, not in the next 2 generations probably, but I can probably find a way to instrumentalize the system to use my scholarship to learn something new, to use the research funding to open up avenue for left scholarship. That I can do, but to change the system, I don't think I or other academics actually have the power to do that. That's my personal vision. Thank you. Over to you, Ridha.
Thank you, Tika. Teresa, you have some remarks with regards to how the educated middle class can better connect with the broader working class segment, and also what is your comments on the idea that to involve, to engage with the system in order to change the system itself?
Thank you. I think basically with regards to the left movement, first of all, the workers' organizations movement is very weak in the Philippines, very, very weak. I think less than 10% are organized. But at the same time, they gain strength once they join left movement. And generally, we have the CPP, and then you have the non-CPP, which consist of ideological blocks, which are mainly generally from the middle class, intellectuals, academics. So they come in there as a movement, the labor movement, their own organizations, where they get a voice, and they find it stronger based on a coalition. And the middle class generally has to rely on them because they're supposed to bring in the votes, for example, in elections or that. So I think that's the kind of relationship. So to what extent are their voices being heard is another question, because you also have different agendas there with the working class part of ideological bloc. I don't know if this is there. So I think that is part of being part of a movement strengthens them. And generally, sometimes even the heads of the labor organizations are people from the middle class. Okay. The organizers are middle class. So, and maybe going back to what Dick was saying about the university, we have an all University of the Philippines Workers Union. They fight for the rights, and we pay, everyone pays, all the faculty and all, but it's more of do they get higher pay, higher salaries, but not at the level of changing the system. But it also provides a key to being part of a policy-making body in university, which is called Board of Regents. Board of Regents, where you have seats, which they fought for seats for faculty, seats for representatives, researchers, seats for administrators. So that is a chunk of 3 votes. So usually the left, when I say left, it's more of the CPP left was more organized. They're able to bring in people there, and the other left join in. But in the university, I think the moment you say democratic space, everybody comes in, whether you're left or not. Everybody just comes in. So where there's a threat from the military, they come in. So it's very strong in the University of the Philippines. So in that way, and even when I say, oh, that administrator is so bad, why is he there? Oh, we have to, because it's a concession to the union, to the workers' union. Okay, so you have that also in the university. So yeah, in that sense, so it's not as their own force, they're weak, but they're part of a coalition which makes them stronger. At the same time, to what extent is the middle class also the one leading them, because their leaders are sometimes or generally from the middle class also in terms of the organizing.
Okay.
I think that if you talk about system, that is where they will come in to try to change the system within their own ideological blocks and left movements.
Oke, thank you Teresa. Pertanyaan selanjutnya dari Semi Gulto mungkin ini kalau nggak salah. Untuk Teresa dan Inaya, semenjak kalian berbicara tentang ruang demokratik or both underline democratic space, pertanyaannya bagaimana kita mendefinisikan secara kritis ruang demokrasi ini? Karena banyak kesempatan ketika kita berbicara tentang demokrasi, ruang demokratis ini sebenarnya arena yang diinkorporasi, yang mengkooptasi agenda kiri gitu. Kayak misalkan kita ngomongin agenda perlindungan sosial gitu, yang dianggap sebagai ruang demokratis ternyata dikooptasi oleh agenda neoliberal, makanya jadi asuransi sosial. Ini mungkin kalau kita mau kasih ilustrasi ya. Itu untuk Teresa dan Inaya. Dan untuk Tika gitu, apa kamu melihat bahwa absennya serikat yang kuat dan terpercaya itu menjadi penyebab bagi hilangnya, menjadi penyebab bagi kondisi yang kita bicarakan tadi gitu, precariat, teralienasi. Mungkin itu pertanyaan dari Sami. Mungkin dari Tika dulu kali ya, silakan Tika.
Oke, Mas Semi. Belum kayaknya ya. Hi, Mas. So, yes, I think the absence of a strong union, the one that has impact on workers' life, might contribute to the condition that I elaborated in my presentation. As mentioned by Teresa, the situation is somehow different in the Philippines. Actually, Teresa, when I did my PhD, one friend, he's an academic in the Philippines. So from him, I got to hear the experience of being an academic there, and I was surprised of how different it could be. Being part of a Southeast Asian country, so I thought it was a surprise for me. So the answer to Sami is yes, but for me, unionism is not only about establish a union, establish an institution for workers, and register the institution to Ministry of Labor. It's not about that. You can have an organization, an institution, but if you don't have people who believe in the institution and what it can do, the institution would mean nothing. So at least from my research on drivers in the online transport service, the lack of labor union representative is not only about the lack of organizational structure, but it's also part of a subjective experience shaped by social and historical conditions where union as a movement has been absent. So it's part of the social structure in which we are in. It's not only about establishing institution, because if I say that, yes, the problem now is because we don't have union, and then the solution will be to establish union, but establishing union only in the uni will not be enough without the social basis, relations between people who share common ideas and able to support the cause of the union. Like Teresa said, in the Philippines, no matter what happened, even you're left, but or you're not left, when something happened, people come to the university. It's a safe space for people to talk and express their concern. I don't think that's the cause for us. Okay, thank you. Over to you, Ridha. Sorry.
Terima kasih Tika. Semoga bisa menjawab pertanyaan dari Bung Semi Gultom. Selanjutnya, next to Teresa, how we critically define the democratic space, because it sometimes it can be easily co-opted by the ruling class, the powerful. Please, Teresa.
When you say democratic space, it's simple. the right to express your opinion, the right to voice out without the threat of being killed, which is a reality. I mean, especially under this Duterte administration, you have lawyers being killed because human rights lawyers, not only workers, even farmers, and even journalists. And that's why it was like, maybe, I don't know if it's a slap on the face that the Nobel Peace Prize for Journalism was given to Maria Ressa, a Filipino, actually was CNN correspondent in Indonesia. And she established Rappler, and my God, the legal action which the President Duterte or whoever associated it filed against her. So and they closed down a major television station, although owned by a bourgeoisie, but still it was spewing out they felt against the government. So it's a reality. And maybe going to what Dika was saying, the University of the Philippines itself there is an agreement with government that no military can come in the university to pick up anyone. The university, it has to be the university in coordination with the University of the Police. And the head of the military abrogated it unilaterally. And there was a big outcry, and ironically, even from traditional politicians who were graduates of the university, because of the appreciation of UP as different, as creating, as having a space. Okay, so I think that is very basic, because it instills a fear that you're not able to walk around, express yourself, and so that is what you say about democratic space.
Okay.
Especially with impunity. I mean, the killings of people. I think we have the most journalists killed in the world, even compared to the Iraq War or anyone. So that is a reality of the democratic space all over the country.
Oh, thank you, Sister Teresa. Inaya?
Yeah, I completely agree with Teresa. And I'm reflecting now on some debates and conflicts within the democratic space that Teresa defined in Indonesia. The human rights agenda is, for at least in my case as a Marxian academic, is less about problematizing individual rights than using it as an instrument to make sure that none of my comrades, fellows, allies experience intimidation, persecution, and death. It's very basic. It's living free of fear, being able to express your experience in a space in which you will not face consequences from the ruling class. And if you do, you have people on your left and right to protect you. In this case, my allies in the human rights movement, they're socio-legal scholars, they're lawyers who fully believe in the objective and formal legal formal instruments of the law, but they defend left or journalists who are reporting on corruption in the extractive industries. They are on the front line defending them. I would think that criticizing an ally within the democratic space undermines the left agenda in that movement. And there's a thing that we mentioned, Teresa, it's called Gerakan Intelektual. It's intellectualism for cosmetics, just for being, I'm a Marxist or I'm a liberal, pluralist or whatever. I actually really don't care. I look at the actions, the movements, the social basis, the solidarity, and whether or not the person would stand up for someone else in a setting in which someone else, not of themselves, are being bullied in a corner. And if that person's not there, for me, whether they're on the left or on the right, they're not my ally. They're not my comrades. I'd like to give an example of Islam Bergerak. So it's Islam in Movement. A new friend, her name is Rizky Afiat. I was trained in the Al-Azhar, the Islamic modern education system, and I gradually left it behind and self-indoctrinated with new terminologies because it made more sense to me socially. And her presentation, sorry, Rizky Fiat, I'm speaking on behalf of you. She argued for a redistribution of wealth through the zakat system. So she connected two bodies of work within the mazhab, the hadith, and also the Marxist, orthodox Marxist class analysis. And to me, it pulled me out of that, it pulled me back into and out of the kind of social space that I was, the religious social space that I was indoctrinated in. So when we define a democratic space, it's a space to allow, enable deliberation in which no one is morally right because the material conditions is wrong, it's exploitative. So it's a very practical and actual, I completely agree with Teresa, a really practical, actual material space. And if the actions are not there, there's no social basis, it's not a democratic space. We need to find it in the smallest pockets that are available. And as Tika says, it's fragmented and individualized, atomized, and the task for left intellectuals is to connect them together, bind them together as much as material condition permits. So that's the way for non-cooptation, to prevent cooptation. So begin with actions. Thank you, over to you.
Thank you, Naya. Makasih, Naya. Next quick question from TI19, Demas Rizky. I think this question is exclusive for Teresa here. He's just curious about how the left, particularly the CPP, can maintain their basis because they still maintain their agenda for national democratic politics, right? And one of their agenda is to also maintain their armed struggle. So how the NPA, the CPP, maintain their politics in the midst of electoral politics right now?
I think for as long as there's poverty and inequality,
Oh,
and yeah, and even if we had growth of 7%, but unequally redistributed, they will attract, they will also attract. But the question is, how strong are they? They were not as strong as during the martial law period because of all the abuses. But at the same time, they remain to be the most organized because the non-CPP left consist of a lot of disorganized groups. And so I think the strength is still with the CPP in that sense. And so I think they will continue to attract. Secondly, even when the split came, a lot of people, the only thing they knew was the armed struggle. Even for a lot of members of the middle class who did not finish their schooling, my God, when they had to go above ground, it was like, where do we go from here? But again, there was more room for the middle class to segue to other opportunities, options, unlike if you were a peasant or a worker. Okay. But that doesn't mean there were also members of the working class which left. So in other words, if you talk about a very organized group, it is still the CPP as compared to those who left, which has factions, and the factions have splintered further. So I think that is what makes for the strength of the CPP. But actually, even in the university, when they demonstrate, they're just like 20 or 10. They're really very few, but it's enough to catch attention of the media. Why? Because sometimes even in the media, there are also former members of the CPP who are sympathetic, and they put them on the news, and it gets to the hour of President Duterte who gets irritated, So even if it's just a few, they have a voice. I think so. It is still the network of, that was what, almost 30 years of organizing, right? And somehow you still have fellow travelers there. Okay, so I think that is how they continue to maintain. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Teresa. Really interesting exposition here, and semenjak kita akan selesai seminar ini pada pukul 11, jadi kita punya sisa waktu 12 menit. Jadi pertanyaan terakhir akan saya berikan ke 3 presenter di sini, dan itu akan menjadi pertanyaan yang diharapkan jawabannya akan diharapkan menjadi pernyataan terakhir dari 3 presenter ini. Pertanyaan terakhir terkait dengan hidup di dua sisi gitu. Di satu sisi kita dihadapi pada fenomena lingkungan neoliberal, di mana kawan-kawan di sini, Inaya, Tika, dan Teresa hidup dalam universitas yang semakin terneoliberalisasi, tapi di sisi lain tetap mempertahankan idealisme progresifnya, mempertahankan gagasan bahwa pengetahuan untuk semua, untuk kelas pekerja. Bagaimana mengolah? How to navigate this living like amphibian? First question probably for Inaya.
Okay. So the question is how to reconcile between the neoliberal condition we live in and the idealism, the Marxist ideals we want to practice. For myself, it's not an idealism. It's not a moral position. It's just a way of life. It's like you sleep and wake up in the morning. It's just something you do. And if the question is how do we navigate the neoliberal knowledge sector, so this applies to NGOs, applies to social entrepreneurialist startup companies or whatever that work with peasants and factory laborers in their donor-driven program. These are the material conditions that are given to us. All of the instruments available can be seen as objective utilities. They're tools. We use them to externalize you use the term idealism, I use the term direction, to externalize maintaining a social basis to strengthen the left movement together with the democratic space that in turn affects strengthening the left agenda. So these are tools. I refuse to look at them as the tools of my master that constrains the left movement on campus and across CSOs. I look at them as objective tools that I borrow from the so-called oppressors to widen the space for democratic action and left movement. It was a process for myself because there were points in which the exploitation was unbearable. And I consciously decided not to do class suicide because I'm used to sleeping on a bed. There's no guerrilla movement that I can participate in. Neither can I use a gun. I think I would be lousy in it. So that's the material conditions in the form of social attributes in ourselves that was a result of a historical process. So navigation would be different and very specific for each individual. The key, I think Tika got it right. The social basis needs to be maintained. Find your allies in your campus or outside your campus. They're your friends, they're your safe space. You will pick up the load. Bergantian in English is what? Taking turns of picking up the load because it's a shared burden. And all of your resources become a commons because there's no property and possessiveness in the paradigm that I've subscribed to. Socialism by practice rather than as an ideal. That would be my answer. I hope it does respond to the question. Over to you, Ridho.
Thank you, Naya. Tika, silakan.
Makasih. I'll try to be short and concise. I've come to learn through my research on workers in the gig economy. I've learned to see myself in the suffering of others. That's how I learned about how working environment at the university can also be exploitative. My theoretical framework look at how our workers' subjective experience are shaped by material conditions. So how to navigate, so the question was how to navigate the neoliberalized university. My answer would be find a way not to feel alienated, not to internalize the individualization that works, that we cannot really avoid. What made me feel less alienated is having friends, comrades that share the same goals. So the answer would be to try as much to develop and strengthen the social basis that can help me to see the problem that I experience not as my individual problem, but to see the structural underpinnings of the working condition. So yeah, the answer will be to establish and maintain the social basis with people who share the same agenda. That means learning to align my agenda with people who might share the common interests, no matter how little our similarity is. That in a system that is really oppressive, that should be enough. How little the similarity can be very little. I think I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Tika. Teresa, last remarks?
Okay. I think in the university, it's very important the positions of power who makes decisions. So the chancellor, the president, because they provide the environment. And I think we've been quite fortunate so far that, and it's political also who gets appointed, because they will pave the way to support the dissent that goes on in the university. And for example, even from the office of the president, we have martial law textbooks to highlight the atrocities of the martial law period, because the Marxists are so rich, they are rewriting history. All the textbooks, and even our undergraduate students do not know about martial law, so they accept. So actually, the next president might even be the son of the dictator. It's really horrifying. After 50 years, you have the son of the dictator now going to be the president. So, and you really, so the university is under siege. At the same time, maybe just the last on the neoliberal agenda. But it was such a, I would say, a bloody war in the university when there was a move for general education to be taken out. So that means if you're taking engineering, they wanted it, economics, you do not have to take social sciences or the arts. And for us, that is where the creativeness and the critical thinking comes in. So it was very, there was a compromise, but it lessened the general education, which actually they would say is the mark of someone who graduates from the University of the Philippines, because of the way of thinking, which is imbibed through these courses that are taught, which are now taken away. So it might as well be a technical school, engineering, economics, business administration. I mean, for them, they can math. They want just to do away with that, just to be able to compete. So that's a reality which was really fought in the battlegrounds of the of the university for social sciences and the arts, for students to still be required to take these courses. Because that is where your critical thinking comes in. So it's really a reality when you say all these issues of neoliberalism. It's easier to rally people under anti-dictatorships, but to say anti-neoliberalism, it's kind of a vague thing that has to be, you know what I mean? It's harder. I mean, it's because it can be positive, it can be negative for some people. And maybe just the last, I think in the writings, it's very clear the impact of neoliberal policies, the rice tariffication, which opened up the floods of imported rice with our farmers losing their livelihoods, all these imported goods coming in. It's a reality, and again, take advantage of the university. It also creates spaces. We have this extension load credit of, instead of 12 units, 3 units where you can devote on extension work, which can be NGO work, not matter what ideological persuasion, but so there is a provision for that kind of activity. But again, it depends on the leadership also. Very important. So there's so much at stake. Who will be the leadership of the university? Whether this is a liberal, a left, or a right wing, it affects the way the academic community will be controlled, will be behaved, and the contentions that will exist in it. Maybe I will end there.
Thank you, Teresa. What's a nice summary to sum up our discussion here about the importance not only to see what Tika says as a social basis, but also the leadership. So it is more like top to the bottom and also bottom to the top, right? The process that we need to.
I think just a correction: the bottom has to choose the top.
Yeah, but
it has to come from the bottom. Yeah, because if it's the top, so there is a pressure from below to choose the right person, and not somebody who is imposed from the top. It's a challenge. It depends also on the Philippine president. In the case of our university, it depends. They will decide who the leader will be. Yeah. Okay, sorry.
It's okay. Yeah. Terima kasih semuanya. Thank you for all the presenter here. I really enjoy the discussion here. Although it might not be, and I'm sorry for those who already. Sorry, I'm talking in English. Mohon maaf terhadap attendee yang sudah mengajukan pertanyaan. Saya sebagai moderator mohon maaf tidak dapat mengakomodasinya karena keterbatasan waktu. Tapi jangan khawatir, ini adalah momen pertama dan sudah pasti bukan momen yang terakhir. Jadi kita akan banyak membuka ruang diskusi lagi, dan kalau mencari jawaban tentu kita bukan ahlinya. Yang kita bisa tawarkan di sini adalah mengajukan pertanyaan dan bagaimana kita menjawabnya secara bersama-sama. Terima kasih sekali lagi. Thank you Inaya, thank you Teresa, thank you Tika. Hope we can meet again. Saya harap kita bisa bertemu kembali dalam kesempatan yang lain. Terima kasih semua kawan-kawan yang sudah hadir. Salam olahraga, salam sosialisme. Terima kasih. Sampai jumpa.
Sampai jumpa. Thank you so much, Tessa and Tika. That was.
Thank you very much, Inaya, Tika, and Mohammed. Very nice.
It's a pleasure to join.
So, Teresa, in what faculty did you teach in the UK?
Political science.
Oh,
that's my appointment in the university. I'm professor of political science, and this at CIDS it's an administrative job, so it has a term, and after that term I go back, but actually I still have to teach like 3 units. Yeah, because it just gives me 9.
We are in the same cohort then. I am in political science as well.
And I also noticed in that project Inaya, a lot from political science. Yes. So there's a mother unit. My mother unit is political science.
Okay. Hugo, can we just close the Zoom and?
Yeah.
Yes, I can end the meeting now. If already finished. Thank you, Miss Teresa. Thank you, Kak Inaya.
Sampai ketemu lagi. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you,
Kak Inaya.
Special thanks to Hugo. He's the secretary of the board. He did the legwork for organizing the Zoom.
Yeah.
Special thanks for
Thank you, Hugo.
we sorted out all the technical glitches until 10 p.m. last night. So
Okay.
we all have been in your position and still willing to be in your position bergantian. Thanks Rizal and Hugo.
Thank you, Bu Rizal, Bu Rido, Miss Teresa, Kak Inaya, Diatyka.
Ya, bye.
Bye.
Bye.